Creating a multi-step form with the help of SplideJS is a lot easier than you think, especially when you have ChatGPT by your side producing all the custom code and you can focus on the other parts of the build on Webflow and Wized. With that being said, you have a lead and they'll be using this form to share all their in-depth project details. So let's run through this form here and I'll be showing you how to prepare this form inside of Webflow, tie this in with Wized, and make sure that our data is sent over to our database, which in this case is Airtable. So let's get started. Now, first thing I want to do is I'm going to fill everything out just by typing gibberish. And for the email, instead of, well, as you can see by the prompts, I've done this quite a few times. Okay, so instead of completing this, I'm just going to leave it as it is and click out of it. And you'll notice that it throws in this error message. So we're also going to be covering that in this video on how to handle errors like this and make sure that all our input fields are validated before it moves on to the next slide. So yeah, you'll notice that I've filled everything out, but the continue button is not activated until I put in the email. Awesome. Same goes for all the other slides. In this form, I have marked all the input fields as required. So yeah, you will need to fill in everything. UX wise, I should provide this to the user that, you know, they all need to be filled in, which is something that I've completely missed out. All right, now let's submit this. Awesome. Now let's head over to our Airtable and you'll notice that our submission has come through. This is looking nice. Awesome. Also, you'll notice that as I keep scrolling, there are a lot of empty fields here, and that's because these empty fields are a part of a different questionnaire. I provide both Webflow and UX and UI designing as a service as well. So yeah, I have included, these are all included in the clonable. So whether you use this or not is completely up to you. And that's that for the Airtable side of thing. However, we will be circling back to Airtable later in the video. So yeah, let's jump over to Webflow and understand what our setup looks like. Okay, so now over on Webflow, let's head over to our navigator and open this up. Okay, so we have our form block, and then inside the form, we have our questionnaire wrapper, and inside this questionnaire wrapper, we have our Splide div. And if you open this up, you'll notice that we have the Splide, we have the Splide track, Splide list. So in case if you haven't worked with Splide before, you need to maintain this same HTML structure. As a matter of fact, if I switch over to Splide's documentation here and head over to their HTML structure, you'll notice that they provided this here. So you will need to maintain the same structure for this to work. So you have your slide track, slide list, and then all your slider divs. So we have copied this exactly the same way that they have provided on their documentation. So yeah, that's that for the Splide structure. And of course, the slide is basic. The slide, is your actual slides. And inside each of these slides, you have your, each of these slide contents laid out. Of course, you can be creative inside each of your slide divs. You can set this up whichever way you want to. Now, for the purpose of while you're inside of Webflow and editing the slider, what you want to do is if I select Splide list and change this to VFlex, then you'll notice that we have all our slides in view now. So you can edit each of these slides whichever way you want to. Now, moving up, okay, so starting off with the first slide, these are pretty straightforward stuff, just a welcome screen. Also, another thing to point out is that you'll notice that each and every slide has, of course, one button, and then you have another button on slide number 2, and then you have 2 buttons on slide 3, and then 4, and 2 buttons on slide 5 as well. And it's very important that these slides maintain the same class, because we're targeting these forward and the next and the previous button with these classes. So on the first slide, the button has a class of next button, and then the second one has next button, and then we have a combo class of is disabled. Now the reason why we put this in here is, of course, by default we want this to be disabled, and once the user fills in all the inputs, that's when we get rid of this combo class, and this is all handled over on the custom code. Also, another thing is that with this selected, you want to also make sure that the cursor is selected to not allowed. It's just for a better user experience, so that the user is aware that they can't click on it. And that is it. So let me just check for the prev button. Okay, so the previous button doesn't have any combo class, it's just the next button that has a combo class. And then, of course, another thing to point out is that all your input fields, the ones that you definitely want your user to fill in, you just need to mark it as required. And that's pretty much it. Okay, and I believe that is it. And of course, this goes without saying, each of these input fields and text areas have already got their Wized attributes added in. I will, however, apologize for my poor naming convention. I'm not really great at it, but I will include the documentation that Wized has provided on being able to name your elements properly, and it's super helpful. So I highly recommend that you guys follow that. Now let's hide our slides, because that's that for the build part of it. All right, so slide list. I'm going to turn this to horizontal flex again. Okay. Now let me show you the custom code that we have on our page settings. Starting with the inside head tag, we have linked our SplideJS CSS, very important. And also keep in mind that you can override CSS as well on Webflow, which I have done in this case. You'll notice that there is slide, which has a height of 0, overflow hidden, and then there's a transition as well. And then there's a slide is active, and then there's a height of auto. The reason behind this is that if I close this, you'll notice that over here, when you're looking at the form, there's like this giant gap here. And of course, this gap is coming because from the content on the other slides. And we don't want that to be reflected on the actual page. So that's why we've applied that CSS. So that's what that's for. Okay, so scrolling down here, you'll notice that I've also linked in the Splide library. So yeah, you need to link this in, and then we have the actual custom code. All right, so for the first part of the code here, this is initializing the Splide library. Of course, I've used the following options here. And then scrolling down, we have all our selectors throughout the form. So we have our next button, the previous button, and then we have the button primary. The button primary is the submit button, which is right at the end of the form. And then we have our email input. So basically the ID for the email input and the ID for the email error message. So before I go any further, let me just close this and turn this back on so that we can see what we're dealing with here. So in the email, so you need to keep in mind that the email input has this ID here. Of course, the ID is automatically assigned anyway, so we're targeting the email input here. And then on the navigator panel, you'll notice that we have the form field error message. So if I switch this back on, Yeah, so you can see this. You can edit the text if you want to. I've included the error message on all the form fields. I'm not using it anywhere. Actually, yeah, not using this input, the error message, on any other input fields throughout the entire project except for this portion over here. So yeah, right. So yeah, assuming that you're happy with the message, once you're done with the edit, make sure you hide it. Oh, and more importantly, of course, you need to assign the ID, which is this one right here, so that we can target it through the custom code and make sure that when it's not being filled out, we can display this. And of course, we also have a combo class of hide on top of that added to this. All right, so let's jump back to our code. Okay, and then what we have is our function, our regex function, to check for the email. So this expression over here checks if the email has been properly typed in. So it's following the structure properly, like something something at email.com. And if not, then throw in the error message. And that's what this portion of the code is doing. So it tries to validate. So if it's properly done, then don't show the error message. And if not, then do show the error message. Okay, now scrolling down, let's see what we have here. Function to validate mandatory input fields for a specific slide. Okay, so like I mentioned, depending on which slide you're on, and assuming that you have marked all the inputs as required, the code will check that the required fields have been filled in, and it will switch on the continue button. Also, the neat part about this code here is that it anticipates all the various kinds of input fields for your forms. Like you have your text area, your input, your select field, checkbox, radio, and assuming that you're happy with the functionality of the form as is, then you don't really need to adjust this code. You can just leave it as it is. And that's what this part of the code does. Okay, and then we have get the next button with the specific slide. Okay, so yeah, this is where it activates the next button. And then we have additional code here for, well, to check the checkbox and radios as well. And then we have the next buttons. This is where it switches, it toggles the class on and off for the next button. You might remember that we have a additional combo class that it gets rid of, or it adds it back on if the form hasn't been validated. Okay, if this is the last slide, enable or disable the submit button. Again, same thing, but applying to our last submit button. Okay, and then we have more code for our checkbox and radio. Again, this is assuming that there's a checkbox and radio, which in this case, we don't. And that is that. Validate mandatory inputs when the page is loaded. Oh, right. Yeah. So we also have this functionality where when the page loads up, it checks all the input fields that has been marked as required before the user starts filling it out. And then we have click handler for next event. Oh, next button. Okay. All right, so yeah, I think these are pretty self-explanatory. It checks if the fields have been properly filled out before moving on to the next slide. So yeah, if you need further explanation on this code, what you can do is, of course, copy and paste this over to ChatGPT for further breakdown on this. And that's that for the custom code part of it. Hopefully that was clear. Now let's go through our Airtable and see how we've set things up. Okay, so on Airtable, you'll notice that there's a master view, and then we have a Webflow view and UI UX. I'm not going to be covering the how-tos on Airtable. I'm assuming that you're already familiar with Airtable. If not, I highly recommend checking out a few tutorials on YouTube on how to familiarize yourself with Airtable. unless you're choosing a different database, then the principle is going to be exactly the same. The fields inside of Airtable are extremely straightforward. We're using text fields, and then we have the email field, company name. Of course, you can adjust this whichever way you want to. And yeah, that's pretty much it for questionnaire. However, I just want to point out that when you click on Webflow and UI UX or any one of these, okay, so you'll notice that we have two fields here, projects and PDF. So the projects is basically a link field. So this is to link the appropriate project linked to this specific questionnaire record. Now we are going to be addressing these two specific fields at a later stage on another tutorial, because this is more relevant to our dashboard. At the moment for this tutorial, we don't need to care about this right now. So we will be circling back to this in a bit. Now that the Airtable is out of the way, let's head over to Wized and start setting everything up. Now, I'm not going to be showing you how to connect the Airtable on my apps because I don't really want to expose my API key. So if you want to learn how to connect your apps, you can refer to Wiz tutorials. So yeah, but I will not be showing that here. So with that being said, let's first connect our data in request. Oh wait, no, we're going to create our data out request. So let's start off with form submission. This is going to be quite straightforward. I'm going to create a new folder, call it questionnaire, Airtable, database, create item. Okay, so I went ahead and I've redone the whole data out. All right. So first thing that I've changed is the data out request name. So I've changed this to submit Webflow questionnaire form, and then I made sure that it's linked inside the folder questionnaire. And then of course we have all our relevant fields here connected to the inputs. So we have our type, first name. This was quite a tedious task, but very, very easy, of course. Just have to make sure that it's all connected, plugged into the correct inputs. As you can see, if I go through the list, we have the inputs for the Webflow questionnaire and also the UX and UI questionnaire that I have. So I had to kind of go through the whole thing, and I didn't want to put this on the video. So yeah, anyway, they've all been added in. And another thing I wanted to point out is that I've also created an after request. So essentially what happens is when the form has been submitted, what we want to do is that when this request is successful, we want to forward this user to the submission successful page, which is this link over here. I think I need to put / here as well. Questionnaire submission successful. Okay, I haven't tested this out yet. With that being said, I also went ahead and also created the actions. I completely forgot to record this. So let me just run through this real quick. I've also named this the same exact thing as our data out request, which is submit Webflow questionnaire, put it in a questionnaire folder, and then target the WQ submit element, which is the submit button of the form. So on click, we perform the request of submit Webflow questionnaire. So with that being said, I'm going to reload this page. Okay, and just quickly test this out. Actually, I'm going to put in my test and then put Wiz so I can recognize this record over on Airtable. Okay, and submit. Amazing. All right, let's head over. All right, there we go. One test Wized. Perfect. it works beautifully. Okay, and with that being said, of course, that brings this to a wrap. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment and I'll make sure to get to you as soon as possible. And another thing I would highly recommend is to join Wized Discord for further support on anything else. I've left the link on the description down below. And with that being said, I will be seeing you on the next tutorial.